Hello and welcome to the next webinar in the series brought to you by Strengthening the Heartland. My name is Amber Letcher and I am one of the coordinators for the project. So thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, I just have a few announcements for you as we get started. First, if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to type those into the question box and then I will relay those to our speaker at the end. You can also follow along with the slides. If you look at the handout section of your menu, the slides are available for you there. Also, if you joined us before or if you're brand new, I typically ask you to fill out a survey, a brief online survey for us after the presentation. It helps us get a little bit of feedback, and there's also a place for you to request other webinar topics for the future. So even if you filled this out before with a previous webinar, we do ask that you do it each time so we get a little bit of individualized feedback. So if you're joining us live, you'll get that link emailed to you, and it's also available in the chat box right now. If you're watching the recording, you can get that link in the same place where you accessed this recording. And then lastly, I'll direct your attention to our website, which is strengtheningtheheartland.com. So if you'd like to learn more about the services and resources we offer, please feel free to check that out and also share it with others. So with that, I will turn our presentation over to our speaker, a new face to us at Strengthening the Heartland, Michelle Trent, who is the Assistant and Clinical Director at the Compass Center in Sioux Falls, and she'll be talking about interpersonal violence and addictions. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to everyone who is participating today. Hopefully today will be a conversation about interpersonal violence and how addictions intersect with that. Certainly I want this presentation to be helpful for all of you, and so if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer them, so please make sure to type them in. So I'll jump into just a little bit about me. So I, like Amber said, I am the Assistant and Clinical Director at the Compass Center, which is in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And our focus at the Compass Center is on working with both survivors and offenders of family violence and sexual violence. And so I have been there in some capacity for about 7.5 years and have worked with hundreds of survivors and offenders of domestic violence and sexual violence, and have really gotten a good overview of what this looks like. So certainly this is a hard topic to talk about, in that interpersonal violence is kind of all-encompassing. And so we'll talk about definitions, and we'll talk about various ways that it can present itself, but then also talking about addictions and how that plays into it. So we'll jump into the World Health Organization and their kind of definition of the Violence Prevention Alliance and how they kind of define interpersonal violence. So interpersonal violence collectively is really looking at both family and partner and community violence. So if you're thinking about interpersonal, you're talking about between two people. So that is a lot of crime and a lot of bad things. But our focus today really is on the family or partner related violence. And as you see below, that can include the partner or the child or an elder in that family, and also can include both physical, or a combination of physical, sexual, psychological, or deprivation and neglect. And what we know about most violence that occurs in interpersonal relationships is most people experience multiple of these. So it's not common to have interpersonal violence, especially in intimate partner violence and child neglect or child maltreatment, to only have one of these. So most often there's going to be a polyvictimization of several of these different categories. And so it's kind of unique in the sense of, you know, if we look on the other side to community and acquaintance or stranger violence, we would see that most often those would occur kind of by themselves. So it's not when somebody gets mugged, it's not that person who does the mugging then follows them home and verbally abuses them. So it's kind of unique to family violence and interpersonal violence in the family relationship that has kind of all of these components. So in defining interpersonal violence, we can see that it refers to individuals that can be divided in between the two, like I talked about. So the former category, so intimate partner violence and kind of family violence, includes child maltreatment, intimate partner violence, and elder abuse. And so all of those three things are really kind of interconnected. We sometimes see them, especially in the movement of sexual violence or domestic violence or those kinds of things. We tend to see each thing as individual, but the reality is that we know that risk factors for child maltreatment and intimate partner violence and elder abuse often align. So they don't all have the same risk factors, but they certainly, several of them have commonalities amongst their risk factors. So when we're talking specifically about intimate partner violence, what I'm talking about today is physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and or physical or psychological aggression, including coercive acts by a current or former partner. And so what we've seen over the years is that our definition of intimate partner violence or domestic violence has to increase, because we know that our definition of families are increasing over our time. And so intimate partner can look different in different relationships and can look different in different families. And so that intimate partner is someone who has a close personal relationship that can be characterized by any of the following things. So some sort of emotional connectedness, regular contact, ongoing physical contact and or sexual behavior, the identity as a couple, and familiarity and knowledge about each other's lives. And so you can see that this really branches out into populations that include LGBTQ plus communities, and then also in terms of dating relationships or family relationships. So it used to be that the definition of domestic violence or intimate partner violence really just included a spouse or an ex-spouse. And we know that that's just not the world that we live in any longer. And people are having violence in intimate partners or with intimate partners that are not people that they're married to. And so, or with former people that they might have been married to or might have been in a relationship with. Child maltreatment is an intentional act or may not be an intentional act that results in harm or the potential of harm or the threat of harm to a child. So this includes also the failure to provide for a child's need, to failure to protect them from harm or potential harm. And then it can be done by a parent, a caregiver, or an authorized person, so an authorized custodian of a child. So that might include a teacher or a clergy person. It could also include foster parent or other school personnel. So this really is encompassing kind of the whole experience of a child and could be a variety of different things. Like I said earlier, victimization of children especially is rare to occur as just a singular victimization. So most children that are abused in a poly fashion, in that they have several experiences of different types of abuse. We also know that there's risk to children who are abused that they could be abused by other people. So it's common for children to experience abuse from multiple different sources, especially in the home. So if we have perhaps child who's living in the home with 2 adult caregivers plus 3 siblings, it's possible that that child is experiencing abuse by either of the adult caregivers and then by the children that are in the home as well. It could also include other generations of people. So perhaps if grandma and grandpa come and visit, or if step parents or step siblings, those kinds of things come and visit, that could also be a potential person that might harm that child if they are experiencing harm in the home. So in terms of talking about both alcohol and other drug and interpersonal violence, so addiction and interpersonal violence, there's 2 ways to look at it. The first being to look at it from the offender perspective, and then the second being to look at it from the victim perspective. And we'll take a look at both today because both are important for us to really acknowledge that addictions impacts interpersonal violence in different ways, whether you're the offender or the victim. And so we'll talk about both of those today. So really looking at the statistics and the kind of offenders' prevalence of substance use, we can see, first of all, in intimate partner violence, that first of all, kind of acknowledging the limitations of research. So limitations of research in intimate partner or child maltreatment are high, in that we know that reported occurrences of both types of things is probably not the accurate number, in that most, or not most, lots of both intimate partner violence and child maltreatment goes unreported. So statistically speaking, for intimate partner violence, there are statistics that say for every one act of violence that is reported, there's a potential 7 to 10 acts of violences that occur that don't go reported. So if you have a home where someone is calling the police because of a violent incident, it is likely that there was many more violent incidents that occurred to that household or to that victim before or after law enforcement was called or it was reported. The same goes for child abuse, and many of you will know this having worked with children. A child might experience multiple forms of abuse before something is ever caught and reported by someone else, or before that child ever reports that to authorities. And so children, don't often know that what they're experiencing isn't the experience of others or isn't what's supposed to happen. So the younger the child is, the more unlikely they are to have other experiences that tell them that people shouldn't treat them that way. And so their instances of reporting are not real high. And so we know that our numbers for intimate partner violence and child maltreatment are low compared to what the probability of those occurrences happening is in the real world. So when looking at these statistics as we go forward today, know that the numbers listed here may or may not be extraordinarily higher based upon the things that are being reported. But looking at the numbers that we do have, we can see that in intimate partners, the statistics tell us that in about 40 to 60% of incidents, there is a co-occurring use of substances. So that could be immediately post-incident, or immediately prior to incident, or immediately post-incident. But that 40 to 60% of violent incidents that are reported include some sort of substance use. So the next piece that we talk about is alcohol and or drug abuse by the male partner was the strongest correlate of violence. So we know that in terms of looking at risk factors, men that abuse alcohol and drugs are most strongly correlated with violence in their relationship. Not that all men who use alcohol or drugs are violent, but that there is a correlation between the two. We also look to the fact that during times of heavy drug use, that interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence is 11 times more likely in times of heavy drug use. So if you have someone that may not have displayed any violent tendencies ahead of their drug use, it's possible that heavy drug use can be a precursor to violence. But we know that it's more likely going to happen when a person has been using heavy drugs, that they're more likely to engage in intimate partner violence. And then more than 20% of men report alcohol and or illicit drug use preceding incidents. So this is a tough statistic in that this relies on men reporting their behavior. And many of these statistics are related to men. Unfortunately, what we know is that violence occurs across genders in intimate relationships. And so much of our statistics relates to men because that's the most common form of reported violence in relationships. But especially for men, it is very challenging for men to report intimate partner violence for a lot of societal reasons. So, we live in a society that promotes masculinity, which then essentially says the men the man is the stronger person, the man is the person that controls the situation. So in the event that a man is abused by their female partner, that's really hard to talk about because they will perhaps be looked down upon. There's also occurrences and reported statistics that tells us that often men's experiences with violence are devalued, or that they are not treated in the same experience as women. So it's often kind of like we downplay the abuse that men experience at the hands of women. And so men are then likely not to report the significant pieces. So if a man says, you know, this is what happened to me, and somebody says, are you sure that that's what happened? Or maybe it looked different, or how could you be beaten up by a girl? Then men are less likely to actually talk about the things that are occurring. So our statistics are very male offender heavy, which is unfortunate because then we can't actually look at the realities for women offenders and male victims. So additionally on the statistics, we can see that this is reported, right? So this is people that are voluntarily reporting that they used alcohol and or drug use preceding the incident. It's very likely that people are not real motivated to tell the truth here when we're asking them those questions. So most often, especially for folks that may not acknowledge their problems with alcohol or drug use, so they may have a problem, but they're not in the point of being able to acknowledge it, they're going to downplay the impact of alcohol and or drugs in the violent incidents that they have perpetrated. So for child maltreatment, we know that in about 35% of cases reported, and these are reported to either law enforcement and or child protection, and is specifically related to parental child abuse. We can see that 35% of those incidents consumed alcohol or drugs during the time of the incident. So there was alcohol or drug use present and being consumed at the time that child abuse in whatever form occurred. And then the other interesting statistic here is that having a history of harmful or hazardous alcohol use increases the risk of child maltreatment. And so this is really looking at if there's a history in the home, if there's a history of caregivers, if there's a history of child use of harmful or hazardous alcohol use, that increases the risk of child maltreatment, which is an interesting thought. So what we know about substance use, of course, you know, and many of you know this is not, you know, rocket science by any means, but this, you know, we know that alcohol, that drug use of all sorts has a combination of these things. So first of all, it lowers the inhibitions. So we know this, we can see this by going to any college campus on a Friday night and seeing the kinds of things that folks that are consuming alcohol engage in. They're definitely things that are not going to be things that would be typical. So there's a little bit more restraint when a person is not under the influence of substances. So it lowers inhibitions. Certainly some substances increase energy and activity. So if we have a person who's consuming a high amount of a substance, or if it's a substance that's very potent, their energy and activity levels might be impacted. We also know that substances increase poor decision making. So going along with the inhibitions, people tend to not make the same decisions that they would make when they're using a substance as when they aren't. We know that increased agitation can occur with substances. So we know that regardless of the substance, this is documented in lots of substances, that agitation can occur. And agitation, interestingly, with substances can occur at different points. So, you know, I've worked with folks in the past that say, you know, I'm a happy drunk, but then they'll say, but the more I drink, the more agitated I get. So alcohol may delay that agitation, but it doesn't mean that that agitation won't be there. Then we have other substances like meth use, where we might have somebody that uses meth and they are agitated right in the beginning, and as they come off of that substance, their agitation decreases. So interesting to think about the point in which violence could occur with those folks based upon agitation. And we'll talk more about that coming up as well. We also know that there are increased difficulties in communication when someone is using a substance. So if someone is intoxicated or using heavily, we know that their ability to communicate about important things goes down. And then we also know that substance use increases personal stress. So substance use obviously creates financial concerns in some situations and in some homes. It also might lead to work problems. So perhaps a person is getting terminated from their job or having work-related issues. And then it also leads to home problems. So if we've got, let's say, a person who's using substances, their ability to care for the children in the home goes down. Their ability to contribute to the home, so doing laundry or dishes or all the things that are day-to-day things, decreases with their substance use. So what's interesting about this is we could say that this is also a list of risk factors for violence in intimate relationships. So all of these things contribute to violence happening within a family setting. So when people are under additional stress, when there is increased agitation, when there's poor decision making, increased energy or agitation, those things all lead to or can be part of what leads to violence in the home. Certainly it doesn't have to, but these are certainly risk factors. We also know that risk factors exist in terms of the socioeconomic status of folks. And so if you have people that are coming from maybe increased areas where there's financial stress, so increased poverty and those kinds of things, that can certainly be a risk factor. We also know that people who have experienced trauma in their history are more likely to engage in substance use. And so that's also a risk factor for violence within a relationship. So you can see how the risk factors and the problems created by substance use also are part of the risk factors and problems that bleed into violence in relationships. Oops. So if we go on here, you know, I think that this is a really humorous slide that talks about correlation doesn't imply causation, right? So this guy up here has a headache when he has his shoes on in bed, but you know, this other guy is pointing out, but yeah, you were drunk last night. So the shoes on in bed probably are not what caused the headache. The shoes on in bed are a correlation, but they're not the cause. And certainly when we're talking about violence in relationships, the statistics tell us that, and the research tells us that although substances are correlated to violence, that they are not the cause of violence in a family or in an intimate partner relationship. So oftentimes we have people that say, well, if we just treat the addiction, if we just treat the substance use, we get rid of the violence in the relationship. But when you really sit down and look at violent relationships, people miss often that the violence is not just the physical act of punching somebody or the physical act that causes a physical injury. What we know about intimate partner violence is it's less about anger management and violence and more about power and control. So if you take victims and perpetrators of violence in a family or in a relationship, including child maltreatment, and you go back over time, it's rare that that violence occurs in a vacuum. So typically there's other predictors, typically there's other pieces that are involved in this, whether or not the person is on substances. So for intimate relationships or domestic violence, if you talk with victims of domestic violence and talk about things like what happened before the violence, they're going to tell you things like he was really, or he or she was really controlling. He always knew where I was going and made sure I was going to the places that I said. He would show up at my work to make sure that I was there. He or she looked at my phone and got mad when I was talking to people that they didn't think that I was supposed to be talking to. He or she, you know, did all sorts of other things up to aggression and violence, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that exists in there. And often people will say that those things didn't occur just when the person was on a substance. They might have gotten worse when the person was on a substance, but they didn't just occur when they were on a substance. So sober or not, those things were happening in that relationship. And again, looking at children, and when we're talking about child maltreatment and the fact that many children are poly-victimized, they might have physical violence occurring in their home when their parent is intoxicated, but they might have neglect occurring in their home when their parent is sober. And so child maltreatment and intimate partner violence are certainly correlated. We know that when people are using substances, violence and those kinds of things can increase because of all of those things we talked about on the last slide, but we know that that is not what causes violence. Another really, I think, humorous causation and correlation piece is to think about ice cream sales and murder rate tend to go up at the same time, but murder rates go up in the summer for a variety of reasons, and so do ice cream sales. And so, you know, it's not necessarily that ice cream sales, it's not that the people that are going out and eating a ton of ice cream are the people that are murdering others. It's that the temperature increases, and we know that that has a correlation to both ice cream sales and murder rate. So it's the same thing here. We could, you know, change out these two. So if we replaced alcohol or substance use in the spot that says ice cream sales and replaced interpersonal violence with murder rate, we would see this exact same thing, that certainly substance use might go up and create violence and those kinds of things, but it's certainly not what's causing those pieces. So in terms of, you know, looking at how do we work with offenders of offenders who are using substances, but that also are perpetrating violence in their interpersonal relationships. I think that the most important thing here is to really look at the fact that substance use and interpersonal violence have correlations, not causations. Therefore, we can't expect to resolve one problem by fixing another. So it's good for folks to go and get treatment for their substance use. And you know, at the Compass Center and every other rape crisis center or domestic violence agency that I think is in existence in the world, we would say, yes, that person should go and get treatment for their substance use and substance dependence. But we know that just doing that doesn't solve the violence problem. We know that their behaviors, controlling behaviors, manipulative behaviors, violent behaviors occur at the same time as substance use, but don't occur because of substance use. They're not caused by it. So only fixing one problem isn't going to actually fix violence. So if you're working with someone who is both violent and addicted to a substance, knowing that both of those pieces need to be addressed, and hopefully simultaneously, but you know, systems are not always set up that way. And so certainly if not simultaneously, then at least you know, one after the other to really address those pieces. The next really important thing here is to recognize that substances can often be used as an excuse for violence. So in society, we kind of create an out for people who are violent by saying, well, they were drinking. So if we see, you know, a bar fight that's happening and we go, well, they were both drinking, so that kind of justifies the violence a little bit in our minds. And this same thing then gets passed on to other people who use violence when they are, or who use violence when they are intoxicated. And so many times you're going to be working with an offender who says, well, I don't have a problem with violence, I have a problem with substances. And part of the work that we have to do in helping those folks in whatever capacity we're working with them on is to help them recognize that these are two different problems that both need addressing. So we can treat the violence, but if we don't treat the substances and you continue to use the substances, your inhibitions are going to go down. So even if you work really hard on changing your behavior, your violent behavior, when you consume a substance and your inhibitions go down, your ability to not do those violent things that you've been working so hard to stop goes down as well. The same, you know, if we flip it on the other side and are thinking about substances, and if we treat substance use, that's great. But sober people are still violent, and we have to treat the violence and not only the violence, but the controlling behavior that goes along with both child maltreatment and interpersonal intimate partner violence. So in both of those cases, much of the violence that occurs, much of the behaviors that occur are related to control and power rather than to anger management. And so if we don't address the parent who feels like they have to have ultimate authority over their child, even if we get them off substances, if that's still their belief, if they still display those controlling, manipulative behaviors, that child, even if they're not getting physically injured, they're still at risk for maltreatment because of psychological aggression, because of neglect, and all of those kinds of pieces. So this is a multi-fold issue that has to be treated as such, not just one thing. And so the danger, if you have somebody that says, substance use is my problem, they'll go through treatment, they'll get sober, and then they'll go back into the environment where those other pieces were occurring, and that violence is still occurring for that victim. And then the other thing to know is that certainly statistically speaking, we know that many offenders are also victims of some sort of violence in their life. So, you know, thinking back to like the ACEs study and all the things that we know about traumatization and victimization, we know that trauma is part of the risk factor for violence in a variety of ways. And so if you are working with an offender, the likelihood that they also experience their own victimization is high, and that needs to be assessed for. So if you're working in a substance abuse facility, or if you're working in a counseling facility or school facility, we can't discount the possible correlation between past experiences and their offending behaviors now, and especially teenagers. So if you think about teenagers and children, oftentimes we see, many of you that work with children are probably very much in agreement with this, that many a times when we have children who are violent, when we have children that are offending, even in their own intimate partner relationship, if we really look back in their history, we find a history of their own victimization. So we can't treat their offending behavior apart from their victimization behavior, because the two are connected. And that then that's also then connected to their substance use. And so you can see the problematic nature of treating one of these in a silo from others. And so knowing that it's an important part to look at that person as a whole. So now we're going to kind of switch gears and look at the victim and how alcohol and other drugs and interpersonal violence intersect with the victim specifically. So certainly we know that, you know, statistically speaking, on the last slides, we talked about the amount of offenders using substances in violent relationships and violent interactions. Now we're going to talk about victims and their use of substances in their relationships as well. So first of all, really thinking about women substance users, again, here, the statistics and the research about men being victims is poor. We just don't have it, because we've so long, you know, the domestic violence movement started out of a feminist movement. And so, of course, in the beginning of that movement, people were more likely to look at domestic violence as being the woman is the victim and the man is the offender, because it really did start out of that feminist movement. And not that that's a bad thing. I think that that needed to happen in a lot of ways, but there are limitations created by that then in we have been less likely to study men who are victims of violence than women. So many of these statistics could also be true for men in a variety of ways. We just don't always have the research to tell us those things. But anecdotally speaking, I can tell you that many of these things are the same. You know, in the work that we do at the Compass Center, we provide a offender treatment program for both offenders of domestic violence, and then we also offer services to survivors. And we know that many of the men coming into our program, a large percentage of the men coming into our program are victimized themselves in some capacity. And so, you know, certainly our experience is that they are more likely to be victims. You know, research is catching up to that. So this slide talks about women substance abusers are more likely to be victims of violence. So this is an interesting statistic that talks about women who are currently substance users that become victims of violence. So there's a lot of reasons for this. And, you know, again, talking about polyvictimization. So statistically speaking, if you have experienced one violent interaction, so if you have experienced child maltreatment in your life, if you've experienced a sexual assault as a child or as a teenager, you're more likely to experience those same things going forward. And so many people might have started a substance addiction when after a victimization occurred, perhaps when they were a child or perhaps when they were younger. And so they might start, it's kind of the chicken or the egg argument here of what starts first, the substance use or the victim of violence. And it's hard to really kind of pin that down. But we know that at the time of this research, looking at women substance abusers are more likely to be victims of violence. This can be looked at in multiple ways. First of all, people who are intoxicated are sought out by perpetrators. So statistics tell us that perpetrators, especially of sexual violence, of intimate partner violence, look for vulnerabilities. Substance use creates a vulnerability. And so they look for people that are more easily controlled. So if we really believe, and the research tells us that intimate partner violence is about power and control, then it stands to be true that perpetrators are going to look for somebody that's easier to control. And so substance use creates that. So if you've got a person who is on substances, especially a heavy substance user, the ability to control them is much higher than a person who is not. So it's a weapon used by perpetrators. We also have seen and do see instances where the perpetrator uses the alcohol or the drug as a weapon. So they might actively get that person intoxicated so that they're easier to abuse. This is especially the case with sexual violence, in that it's much easier to sexually abuse somebody who is intoxicated and is unable to be really in control of themselves than it is to sexually abuse someone who is not intoxicated. So it's a weapon used by perpetrators when they see somebody who's on substances, but then is also used as a weapon to get somebody intoxicated. You'll see this in bars across the country. You'll see this in homes across the country where the perpetrator encourages the use of alcohol, or they might say things like, when I'm drunk, I expect you to be drunk. And so even if that other person does not want to be intoxicated, the expectation and the threat is, if you don't get drunk when I get drunk, then you're going to be injured. The other thing to know here is that substance abuse for folks decreases their ability to stay safe or follow safety plans. And so in the event that someone is intoxicated, they might have intentions to call a friend for a ride home when they get intoxicated, or they might have intentions to stay sober on that particular night and have safety plans in place for themselves, and then they become intoxicated and they can't follow those, or they can't recognize unsafe situations because of that intoxication. And so certainly that creates an opportunity for perpetrators to utilize against them. And we're always very careful here in talking about this, because people will often use things like, well, she was drunk or he was drunk, and so what did they expect would happen? This is a common myth that we at the Compass Center and in my work with victims, I really try to combat, in the sense of, we're using substance abuse as a way to blame the victim, when the reality here is that perpetrators are choosing to perpetrate and they're looking for someone. So you can see this happen when there's been research that's happened and talking with perpetrators, they'll tell you that they went out looking for someone to perpetrate against. And if they couldn't find it with this person, they're going to go to the next person. So it's not that that one person who was intoxicated caused it, is that they were found by the perpetrator who then chose to use abuse against them. So a slight shift in the way we view things, but an important shift in the way we view things. On the flip side, we know that substance abuse is higher in women who have experienced interpersonal violence than women that have no interpersonal violence experience. And the same goes for men. This is, they are more likely to use both tobacco and marijuana, and they're 70% more likely to heavily drink alcohol. This makes a lot of sense if you work in the trauma field or if you've worked with victims, in that people are constantly searching for a way to numb their experiences. And so if they have been a victim of extreme violence, they are looking for an extreme way to numb themselves. Substances then create the opportunity for them to numb out of those things. So there's a high risk for people who are using substances before they were ever a victim of violence, but then there's also a high risk for people to begin using substances after they've been a victim of violence, which then, if you're kind of following along here, then if we look at the second piece that says they're more likely to engage in substance use, then we circle back up to the top portion that says they're more likely to be victimized, which then says they're more likely to use substances, which then says they're more likely to be victimized, and we just spin around in this circle. And so substance abuse, when you're looking at it on the victim side, is really kind of this spinning that it's more likely to occur in a variety of ways, and then it's really hard to stop. So once you get into that cycle, it's a really hard thing to change. And so we have lots of victims who are victimized multiple times and have multiple experiences with violence in their relationships, and substances being a part of those things. So things to keep in mind when you're talking about working with victims. Certainly the first one talks about that substance use can be a pre-existing condition before the violence, or it can be a result of violence. Knowing which one is important. And I have in here necessary for healing, and I want to talk about that a little bit in the sense of, we have to know, those that work in substance use can better talk to, or substance treatment can better talk about this, but knowing kind of what triggers for substance use are really important. And so here we need to know where did the trigger start? And we might have to go back through 10 different victimizations to find when that trigger started. But knowing, did they drink before they experienced that particular violent act, or did they start drinking after, tells us something about their behavior. It tells us, on the flip side, if they're using it after, it tells us that they're numbing, and that's a very specific thing. And so if we treat the substance use there and we take away their ability to numb, we're going to throw them right into that trauma, and they don't have the ability to cope with that. And so knowing that they started using after the violence tells us that we have to work a lot on coping skills. We have to work a lot on replacement behaviors, because if we strip away the thing that they're using to numb, and they don't have the skills to be able to cope with it because they didn't when they started using their substance use, we know that they'll probably just go and find a different way to numb, and that other way to numb is probably going to be just as unhealthy. So we take away their use of substances, but then we talk about there's lots of cases of folks then getting addicted to shopping or gambling or food, or the list goes on and on. So if we take away substance without knowing that this is the way that they numb, we run that risk of just sending them into another addictive behavior. The second one here is the same as I put on the working with offenders slide, because this is a really important thing to recognize that substance use can often be used as an excuse for violence, and then that may cause victims to excuse behavior when substances are used. So it is very common in the work that I have done. I can't count a number of times that I've had this conversation with victims where they go, well, if they just stop drinking or if they just stop using meth, then they wouldn't be violent any longer. And I have been on the flip side of that, seeing how that doesn't work. So I've worked with survivors before that said, yep, they just need treatment. And that person goes and gets treatment and they get off the substances. And 6 months later, that person is back in my office going, well, they're off substances, but they're still violent. And so we have to help victims understand this as well. We have to help victims understand that there is a correlation, but not a causation, and understanding that substances are part of what needs treatment, but that person also needs to choose to change their controlling, manipulative, violent behaviors in order for that violence and child maltreatment to stop. This is often the case with kiddos. So if you think about little people and the way that their brains work, they see dad or mom consuming alcohol, and then they feel mom or dad hitting them. And so in their minds, they go, well, if mom and dad would just stop drinking alcohol, then they would stop hitting me, which is a really simplistic way of looking at things, but we know that that's not true. And so for kids, this will often be a challenge because they'll come in and say, you know, mom and dad don't have a problem. Mom and dad aren't bad. Mom and dad just drink. Mom and dad just use drugs. And so helping them, of course, developmentally appropriately to understand that there are multiple problems here that mom and dad need to address, substances included, but also the other pieces that contribute to the maltreatment for them. And then the most important thing for survivors and victims is that safety must be addressed first and foremost. And thinking about how substances impact a person's ability to stay safe, we have to get them to a safe place right away. And so if you're working with somebody like in a detox environment or something like that, that comes in and they are on substances, they are not safe to go back to their home because of the violence that occurs there. So we've got to figure out a different plan for them. Maybe that is staying in detox. Maybe that's going to a shelter after they sober up. Something that safety must be addressed. And so we can't help a victim if we don't take into account the way that substances are impacting their ability to stay safe. So really, safety planning is a really key piece of what we do with victims in order to help them heal. You know, and then kind of course, these are references that you can look back at too, and there's a variety of them. But I think, you know, this is an overview of how do we define the intersection of intimate partner violence or intimate relationship violence and substance use. And we can see that causation, or that correlation, but certainly not the causation. Unfortunately, we don't have real good research that tells us what causes violence. We have some thoughts and some theories, but certainly we don't have the answer yet. And so these are very challenging folks to work with, both offender and survivor, because there's so much polyvictimization, there's so much kind of interconnectedness of all of these things that, you know, we used to treat each individual piece separately, and more so the research now is going to, these are not independent problems from one another. And so the treatment options really, I see an opportunity in the next, 10 to 15 years to really expand what we're doing to be able to better treat these folks that have significant experiences of violence themselves, that then might create some risk factors for their own perpetration, but then might create risk factors for substance use or substance dependence. So certainly this is an intro to this kind of conversation, and it's a tough conversation to kind of talk about in depth, but certainly I'd be willing to answer questions if there's specific questions about any of the pieces that I've talked about or further pieces that you want to know about.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We do have some time for questions, so if anyone would like to type those into the question box, I can definitely relay those to Michelle. As I was listening, you mentioned the ACE study, and I also wanted to draw our participants' attention to a previous webinar that we also reviewed the ACE study. So if you're interested in looking at that, more information about that, That's available on our website, strengtheningtheheartland.com. I'll just plug that again. But one thing, while we wait, we give people a chance to type in some questions. You talked a lot about how, you know, there's some research gaps, and there's also some stigmatization, particularly with men who might be victims. I'm wondering if you know of, or if there are trainings for people who might work in areas where they see intimate partner violence, to kind of maybe get rid of some of that bias. Or how do you talk to, you know, a male who might have experienced victimization, so that they don't feel ashamed?
It's a really great question. I want to first pause and talk just a little bit about the ACE study, and kind of I'll plug that a little bit. I think more and more we need to, as a community that works with people, recognize that this study really should dictate the work that we're doing with folks. So if you're not familiar with the ACE study, I think it's imperative for you, in whatever capacity that you're working with people, that you look at that. You know, it has so many implications for everything that we do, from education to mental health to medical to community resources, and the way that we treat homelessness, and just every, I think, problem that we're talking about, the issues we're talking about today included, goes back to looking at those pieces. So if you're not familiar, if you're not utilizing those resources in your professional work, I would strongly encourage you to do so, because I don't think that we can work with humans without knowing those pieces, and especially in the world that we live in today, when we know that violence and those kinds of things is increasing, when we know that the amount of people that have experienced those things are higher than they've maybe, I don't know that they've been before, but are certainly high. We can't work with people in whatever capacity that we work with them without acknowledging their experiences in adversive childhood experiences. So on that note, we'll transition to, you know, certainly working with men. You know, the good thing, I think, is that there are a lot of national organizations that are starting to recognize that working with men who have experienced violence, whether in an intimate relationship or sexual violence, is kind of a unique specialty, and is different than working with women because of unique experiences that men have. And the same goes for folks that identify as you know, different genders, or gender non-binary folks, that there are specific issues that are important to acknowledge and address for those folks. And so there's a variety of different organizations. There is 1 in 6 is an organization that works with men survivors of sexual violence. The National Sexual Violence Resource Council has begun working with more men. Unfortunately, we're just at the start of that. And so men are really kind of at a disadvantage in some ways, men who are victims, in finding a person who is familiar in working with those folks. So really, for men that you're working with, it's important for us all to continue to dig into the research, to dig into the trainings that are out there, because as we go forward, there'll be more. There hasn't been a ton yet. And so that's certainly an area of opportunity, I think, in our field.
Other than that, I don't see any questions coming in, so we will end for today. Thank you so much, Michelle. This was such good information, and your willingness to share it with us and your experience is just really valuable. So we appreciate your time.
Well, certainly, I'm open to folks getting in touch with me as well. You can certainly email me. It's Michelle, MICHELLE, at thecompasscenter.org. So if you have specific questions, more in-depth questions about the work that we do, or the work that we do to help trauma victims, or any of those kinds of things, certainly feel free to reach out. Or if you've got clients that need our services, feel free to reach out. I know there's folks that are coming from a variety of areas, and so you might be going, you know, how do I connect people in my area? So certainly reach out, and I can get you connected with the Rape Crisis Center, or the crisis center that's in your area that specifically works with these types of issues, because there's great ones all across our state and all across the Midwest and the country. So I can certainly point you in the direction of those. Thank you so much for having me.